A fellow at the Hoover Institution, Joseph Felter served as an officer in the United States Army Special Forces, where he saw combat in Panama, Iraq, and Afghanistan. During the Trump administration, Dr. Felter served as Deputy Secretary of Defense for South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. He earned his undergraduate degree at West Point and his doctorate in political science here at Stanford. Joe, welcome.
Thanks, Peter. Great to be here.
Joe, two quotations rather. Quotation one, Admiral Philip Davidson, commander of the United States Indo-Pacific Command, testifying before the Senate last month. Quote, Taiwan is clearly one of China's ambitions, and I think the threat is manifest during this decade. In fact, in the next 6 years, close quote. Quotation two, General Mark Milley. Is it Milley or Milley? Milley.
Milley.
General Mark Milley, thank you. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testifying on Capitol Hill in June, when asked about the danger from China to Taiwan, quote, I think the probability is low in the immediate near-term future, close quote. The threat is manifest, the threat is low. Joe, who's right? And why do two men sitting right on top the United States command structure take different views?
It's a great question, Peter. And then General Milley is still our serving chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I'm with my military background, I'm maybe reluctant to question those decisions, but I actually going to lean towards Admiral Davidson, recently stepped down as our commander of the Indo-Pacific Command. I think the threat is manifest. You cannot overstate the importance of reunifying Taiwan is to China and the CCP and Xi Jinping himself. So many would argue, and I would agree, that China hasn't invaded Taiwan because it doesn't think it can do so successfully. But decades of military modernization, increasing defense budgets, they're improving their power projection capability. And they're getting to the point where they think they might be able to get away with it. And some would argue that they may even see this as a fading opportunity, which raises the risk even more. But that is a huge flashpoint. We got to make sure that China doesn't calculate that it can retake Taiwan at an acceptable cost. And there's a lot of ways we can do that. I personally think the best way to do that is to build Taiwan's own capacities. We certainly need to maintain our commitment to it. If you're familiar with our 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, where we are committed to Taiwan's defense, need to keep doing that. But the best way for Taiwan is to make sure that they build their own capabilities, use their defensive advantages to keep China's calculus that they can't do it successfully.
All right, we'll come back to Taiwan. By the way, that's very graceful, and I can see I'm dealing with a man who believes that you may retire, but you may never take off your uniform. All right. That means you're going to say you're going to be guarded in what you. All right, well, we'll deal with this, Joe. Fine, I get it.
Yeah.
China, from an article that you co-authored in Foreign Affairs, quote, China is the only challenger that could undermine the American way of life. Undermining the American way of life. If China succeeds, how does life change? What will it feel like and look like? In other words, what's at stake here?
Yeah, well, maybe you should ask the folks in Hong Kong, their experience with getting a little bit closer to China. Clearly, China has a very different vision for the future. I think encouraging the vision that the United States has is one that's shared and embraced by other countries around the world, certainly in the region. A free and open region, a rules-based order. China sees things very differently. They definitely have a deliberate plan to become a regional, if not global power. And they're using other instruments of their national power and a whole government approach to achieve that vision. Xi Jinping is basically the emperor for life now, and he is personally committed to this national rejuvenation. His vision for China, there was a speech he just gave, I think last Thursday, just talked about this vision for the new China and how it's going to be in the lead. It's going to have a world-class military. I mean, they're in it to win it, and they're doing all they can to basically pursue their vision, which is entirely at odds with the vision, not just the United States. This is the vision of everyone who wants this rules-based order that the United States invested so much blood and treasure to establish after World War II to continue.
Joe, I want to stay with the point a little bit of how life would be different for us. So the parallel would be Britain. In the 19th century, it runs the world. And by the mid-20th century, it cedes that position to us. And what happens for British people? Well, as they give up the imperial possessions, the colonies, they all have to go to work in the city of London. They don't get to go run India. That changes. but living standards continue to rise. They continue to run their own country. They go to university. Life continues to be good. And in fact, on material measures, improves in Britain, even after they lose primacy in the world. We lose to the Chinese. So what? If you're explaining you have 3 young men, you have 3 boys, 2 of whom are in college right now. How do you tell them life will be different in 20 years if we fail in standing up to China?
Yeah. Again, not to overstate the example of Hong Kong, but this notion of 2 systems, I just, maybe that's a bit extreme, but things are going to change drastically. The British analogy, I don't think is going to hold here. I mean, China's, look how they treat their own people. Look at the Uyghurs. Look at the internal repression. How can we expect any country to be expected to be China to treat them better than their own people? And that's certainly a stark reminder of what the future will look like. Just look inside China. Look at look what's happening right now. Atrocities, genocide. Some would argue, but certainly the internal repression. I would tell my 3 boys, and one of them is going to be serving and maybe on the tip of the spear in this competition, and hopefully it won't turn into a conflict. But very different future that China sees for itself. It wants to be a dominant power, and it won't be the benevolent dictator that we might hope. I think they've proven it time and time again. Again, look at Hong Kong, look at the Uyghurs, look at its own the repression of its own people. That's the ghost of Christmas future that we got to anticipate and hopefully avoid.
All right, we should know there is no way of being committed to a struggle in any more direct and dramatic way than to have a son following you at West Point. So we should note that you have a boy there. This is not a joke. This is not a game. We're not playing intellectual games here for the Felter family. Joe, one more quotation here. The late economist and foreign policy analyst and Hoover Fellow, Harry Rowan, he's writing in 1996, when will China become a democracy? The answer is around the year 2015. This prediction is based on China's steady and impressive economic growth, which in turn fits the pattern of the way in which freedom has grown in Asia and elsewhere in the world. South Korea gets rich, becomes a democracy. Taiwan gets rich, becomes a democracy. So Harry Rowan was making the very reasonable point that everyone in the United States, to which everyone in the United States subscribed. I was in the Reagan administration. It started then. China will get rich, and they'll become, if not a full-fledged democracy, Harry believed they would become a full-fledged democracy, they'll become easier for us to deal with. How could we have spent more than 3 decades so totally mistaken?
Peter, I don't know. I was in graduate school. My academic advisor was Ash Carter, and I think the dean of the
former Secretary of Defense, as he would become.
Yes, and I think Joe Nye was our dean at the Kennedy School at the time. And the saying then was, don't treat China like an enemy or it'll become one. It's time to, and exactly what Harry Rowan, who's brilliant economist, it's China's an outlier. The historical record, yes, as countries' economies grow, good things happen. They become more, internal reforms. They become more liberal. They become more responsible members of the international community. Of course, that's what we thought that was what we thought China's road was going to be. Certainly didn't turn out that way. Encouraging, I think the last administration's national security strategy finally, put a nail on the coffin of the responsible stakeholder theory and called out China for what they are, not what we want them to be or what we hope they will be. And that is that, that there are competitors. Let's hope we don't get in a conflict, but we are in long-term competition with China. All right. And that's the reality. And there's more continuity than difference. You saw the international security strategy from this administration very much along the same lines. But my take, Peter, is that we just probably got the timing wrong. We thought these reforms might come in decades. It may take a century or more. I still, maybe we can talk about this in another question.
So what about the argument? I was talking a week ago or 10 days ago to Amy Ziegart. And Amy said they're communists. That's the difference. Yeah. The South Koreans had an authoritarian regime. The Taiwanese, it's a complicated story, but when Chiang Kai-shek moves over to Taiwan from the mainland, it's a pretty tough regime. They were authoritarian, but the mainland is communist. And that's the difference. And that's what we failed to take seriously. Do you buy that?
I think the ideological component is significant. we're all old enough here to remember 1989. That was a big surprise when the wall fell. So it's not like communism can't erode from within and collapse. But yeah, I think you make a great point, Peter, that the ideological component in China is significant. And
I want to come to the Quad in just a moment, including an explanation of what on earth the Quad is. But first, one country so large and so significant it deserves to be talked about apart from the Quad, and that, of course, is India. From an article that you, Joe, co-authored in a publication called Defense One, quote, India is a longtime partner of Russia, now moving in the right direction, in other words, toward us. But India's deep reliance on Russia for its strategic arsenal and the leverage Moscow maintains, given India's need for everything from spare parts and maintenance to technical assistance, will persist for some time. This will only diminish with positive US engagement. Okay, if I read that, there's a serious hangover or lag effect from all those decades when Indira Gandhi was a supposedly non-aligned leader, but in fact, she was close to Moscow. And we're going to have to work the relationship. Here's the question. What can we give India that they can't get from Russia?
I think a partnership that has a shared vision for the future. I think Russia is not the kind of partner that's going to get you where you want to go in the next century. But more specifically, let's look at defense cooperation, which is an area that I am, more experienced in. We have the best technology. You need to buy U.S. Defense platforms. You can have the very best technology, and you're going to be interoperable with all the other great powers in the region that you want to work with. We can talk about that when we talk about the Quad. But I would say the U.S. offers India. We are natural partners. The world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy, and we have aligned interests. We want to see this region stay free and open. The rules-based order persists. Russia doesn't offer them anything like that. They've got them. They can. Because they're dependent on them for so many spare parts and some of their legacy systems, they can have some leverage. But hopefully they're gonna wean themselves from that. And encouraging India is starting to turn away from Russia. They went from zero to $20 billion from 2008 to present as far as U.S. military sales. So the short answer to your question, Peter, is we are the natural partner that wants to see India become a powerful regional power, a net security provider, and that's in the interest of India, U.S., and all the countries in the region that want to see this rules-based order enforced and persist.
All right. One more. I'm going to be skeptical on the allies. I don't want to be yoked to the memory of our former chief executive, Donald Trump, but when he bristled at the way the allies took us for a ride whenever they could, he was onto some important piece of recent history. Okay, so India. If you're Indian, if you're running India, you say, wait a minute. Let's let of course we can play off Russia against the United States. If the US has better technology, we'll drive the prices down, see if we can't get some technology on the cheap, and so fine. But really, time is on our side. The Americans think that our concern with the Chinese is going to drive us running into the American embrace. Not so. On UN projections, the population of China will have, by the end of this century, from 1.4 billion to 700 million, whereas the population of India will remain about level, at about 1.3 billion. China's big, it's huffing and puffing right now. We Indians who think in terms of decades and centuries will play the Americans off against the Russians and sit tight. Why wouldn't that be a reasonable way for them to approach the problem? Sit it out. Time is on their side.
Well, you do make a good point, Peter, that I emphasize a bit more. I mean, we can't overstate just how sensitive the Indians are to their own sovereignty. They're not looking for a new ally. But I taught international relations at West Point and Stanford. Countries cooperate when their interests are aligned, and we certainly have aligned interests right now with respect to China and many other areas. So I think you paint a little more skeptical picture that I think is accurate. I think India, again, there's a lot of cultural closeness. The fact that these are two large democracies that share so many common interests and common values, Yeah, I think there's going to be a close relationship with India and the U.S., based on many things. So I don't think it's a waiting. Let's not wait the U.S. out.
All right. The Quad, established in 2007 by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, much better just to call it the Quad, represents ongoing talks, a kind of loose alliance as I understand it, but you're about to fill me in on this, among the United States, Japan, Australia, and again, India. Is this a new NATO? Should it be?
So Peter, I would say no. This is not designed to. The Quad it's an informal grouping. The region's four largest democracies coming together to cooperate on areas of mutual interest. It's designed to complement and strengthen existing institutions like ASEAN and other regional institutions, not replace them. I think calling it an Asian NATO has a bad connotation, because certainly these are all independent countries. We talked about India just now, that they're not going to sign up to be part of anyone's alliance, to be clear. But encouragingly, in the last several months, especially with China being the driver of this, that they are recognizing that their interests are better served by working with these large democracies, capable democracies in the region. And also, I think that the grouping can provide leadership. It's not just the Quad working alone. It's the Quad working with what we call like the plus countries, or providing the leadership that's needed to advance common interests in the region. So there's huge potential, huge unleveraged potential. Encouraging the last administration, you have to give them credit for reviving the Quad, and give this administration some encouraging indicators that they're going to keep it going. President Biden had a virtual leaders summit soon after he took office, and there's another one scheduled in person, I believe, in the fall. So great potential for the Quad to be a great informal, if not becoming more formal, mechanism to advance the common interests that we have.
Okay, so you've taught international relations at West Point and Stanford. Could you treat me as one of your slower students? You're assuming that you say, of course it's not going to be another NATO, but why not? NATO worked wonderfully for 4.5 decades. Why not take the Quad, India, Japan, Australia, add in South Korea, add in Vietnam? We have a tricky history with Vietnam, but it's a nation of 60 million people that really dislikes China. And just go right ahead and put it in black and white and have everybody sign a mutual defense accord. If China attacks one, we all respond. Why is that? I can tell you as a professional think that's a borderline absurd, but I as a layman don't see why. Help me.
And it's not absurd, Peter. Actually,
it's not.
I talked Admiral Harry Harris, the former commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, and our more recently the ambassador of South Korea. He was very much in favor of a more
more formal alliance,
more formal, and bringing in South Korea. And boy, he's got an extraordinary amount of experience. I don't want to overstate the concerns of countries like India, certainly given all the progress they've made and the movement they've made just in this last year. But I do think maybe if you want to call it de facto versus de jure alliance, I think we're going to have some reluctance. And remember, NATO very much was a security-focused alliance. And I think the Quad's potential is going to be manifested across many instruments of national power. And certainly the economic component, informational component. I think it's going to be able to do more. And again, if you're an ASEAN country, you feel a bit like, hey, what about ASEAN centrality? Is this trying to supplant the existing regional security institutions that we have already? And where does that leave us? So I think the Quad can be very effective without becoming a formal alliance. Okay,
so here's another. I'm pursuing my own education now, Joe.
Please. And you're not the slow student in the class, Peter.
You had slower than me, you poor. No. That sounds like trouble in that classroom. So the way you're talking about this, one thing I'm sort of trying to get a feel for here, at the end of the Second World War, the Red Army was in Eastern Europe. And the Soviet Union represented an immediate, so it could be argued, so it was very reasonable to argue, an immediate military threat, hence putting together a military alliance. People went along with that, right? The leaders of foreign countries went along with that. So what I'm gathering from the way you're talking yourself and the way you're describing the leaders of these Asian countries, Indo-Asian countries to include India, they don't see China as Taiwan, perhaps. Aside from Taiwan, they don't see, and you don't see China as a significant military threat. Is that right, or have I got that wrong?
Please, Peter, I absolutely see them as potentially as the most serious military threat.
You do?
I would say the countries in the region, they're certainly by geography alone and many other factors, they have to maintain a certain relationship with China. And I don't think it's easier for us, hiding behind the Pacific Ocean to maybe sign a pact. But if you're a country that borders China, I mean, India actually has a long border. It's the only Quad country that has a border with China. And so they're going to look at things a little bit differently. So it's I think countries are going to have the flexibility to define their own relationship with China. And I think a formal military style alliance with the Quad may be something that they see as detracting from that flexibility. But certainly the interests have never been more aligned than ever to recognize China for what it truly is. It's in it to win it. It's out to undermine the sovereignty of any range of countries. And we're seeing that playing out now in real time.
Afghanistan. This is you, Joe Felter, writing the Texas National Security Review. Quote, the United States must at some point depart from Afghanistan, with over 2,400 U.S. service members killed, many more wounded, and nearly $1 trillion spent to date. Close quote. My question is this. Does the military-industrial complex of the United States of America, to use Eisenhower's phrase, does it work? Does it merit the support of the American people? 20 years in Afghanistan, $1 trillion spent for nothing, just nothing. And now we have Congresswoman Luria saying, wait a minute. Davidson's goes before the Senate and says Taiwan's a problem. Milley goes before the Senate and says Taiwan isn't a problem. Jim Mattis, when he's Secretary of Defense, issues a strategic statement identifying China as the #1 problem. 3 years on, the budget doesn't seem to reflect that. Who are these guys? We spend $700 billion a year. They've given us a debacle in Afghanistan, and as according to Congresswoman Luria, permitted our situation with regard to relative to China to erode rather than strengthen it. So that's throwing way too much at you. But at the same time, it's just a question that's in the air on both sides, both Republicans and Democrats. Why do these generals and admirals, why should they command our respect? We've had 2 decades at least of just drift now. How do you answer that one, Joe? How do you make an American taxpayer feel a little bit better about your colleagues in uniform?
Well, Peter, again, this civilian control of the military, the people calling the shots happen to be wearing suits or not uniforms. So certainly the men and women that really run the military. But it's a fair question, and it's a bit personal for me, Peter. I mean, certainly I have a lot of friends that didn't make it back to Afghanistan or are very, very different now, and people I've served with, and I've spent some time there. But let's not forget 9/11 too. And again, it's that going in there, we had a mission. We understood why we were there, and the fact that we haven't had another catastrophic terrorist attack since then. Let's not ignore that. I'm not saying that's was our president of Afghanistan responsible for that, but let's give some credit to the sacrifice made there. But you're right. I mean, we it's 20 years. I personally think that a small presence there could have helped keep things together. I think this is going to be viewed as a mistake to completely
withdraw altogether.
And I remember serving there, under Generals McChrystal and General Petraeus, and we still thought we could win. We thought we could turn the tide. We thought that maybe something like the Iraq surge of the 2008 we might see back in Afghanistan. But at the end of the day, and I have a bit of a background in counterinsurgency, and maybe this is a longer answer to your question.
No, go right ahead. This is fascinating. This is just fascinating.
It's the end of the day. The saying you can't want it more than the Afghans do. At the end of the counterinsurgency is about building the legitimacy of the government. And in Afghanistan, the central government, you get out into the hinterlands, Kabul did not have a lot of legitimacy. So we were, often cases trying to prop up a government that was really not viewed as legitimate in the eyes of Afghanistan. It's a very, very tough challenge. I would say from the counterterrorism, if we can narrow that down, maybe a small force staying there to help provide the enablers, the intelligence support and whatnot was probably worth it. And I do think that there's going to be some horrific images here coming out in the next few months, certainly the next year or so, of just atrocities happening in Afghanistan, horrific things happening to women. And I think we're going to regret leaving under the way we did. That said, we didn't want to have a forever war of 100,000 plus people, but I think a small presence, to advance our counterterrorism interests probably would have been effective. We made some mistakes. Clearly, 20 years was too long and too much blood and treasure spent. But I do think we're going to regret pulling out as abruptly as we're doing right now.
Okay. So, by the way, if you want to, Joe, you're so respectful of, not of me, incidentally, but of your former superiors in the chain of command. And you're also being very respectful of political leaders. So Jim Mattis, in his book Chaos, when he writes about Fallujah, he writes about being given the order to take Fallujah, then the order to stand down, then the order to take Fallujah, all of this coming from Washington, chains being yanked in every direction by people back in Washington who really didn't, Jim would not put it this way, but this is the way it reads in the book, who really didn't quite appreciate what was going on, or that every time they gave an order, Jim Mattis stood young men up, or he stood them back to, all right. So if you would like to say that part of the problem in Afghanistan and part of the problem in our slowness, which I want to come back to China, again, within months of becoming SecDef, Jim Mattis issues a new strategic document and names China as our number one competitor. And here we are 3 budget cycles later, and it's really hard to see any significant response in the Pentagon budget. So you're telling me, Peter, no, it's not the guys in uniform, it's the political system. Is that right? That'd be a fair answer. I mean, I'm just interested, your experience from where you sit, what's going on here?
I mean, our civilian leadership takes advice. The president's going to listen to his chairman, but ultimately it is a civilians are calling the big shots in these types of conflicts. But as we've seen in Afghanistan, you do take the advice of your senior military leaders seriously, and that advice has very often been let's stay the course. We need to keep a presence there. The mission continues. Let me just point also, George Bush Sr., Barack Obama, they all wanted to pivot to Asia and focus on Asia, but because of the terrorism challenge, they weren't able to. I think this pivot to Asia that Barack Obama wanted to do, he got mired back into the war on terror and wasn't able to fully resource a pivot to Asia. I think you're exactly right, Peter. We talk a lot about making the Indo-Pacific theater the priority theater. I was just out in Hawaii talking to the new Indo-PACOM commander just a couple weeks ago. And he's just coming on board, but I think he's also very concerned that, hey, if you're going to call this a priority, let's resource it accordingly.
Behave that way. All right. So back to our own armed forces. Here's you again. Let me quote you. This is the problem of innovation. This is Joe Felter writing in Defense One, quote, rapid innovation in new technologies, cyber, AI, autonomy, access to space, drones, biotech are no longer being led by military and government labs, but instead come from commercial vendors, many of them Chinese, close quote. Okay, in the old Cold War, the Pentagon funds the aerospace industry down in Southern California, and the innovation that the American economy throws off is taking place within, again, to use Eisenhower's phrase, it's taking place inside the military industrial complex. And now it's not. Joe Felter says, no, it's kids here in Silicon Valley. And the nature of the problem, as I see it, redefine it if you'd like to, runs as follows. The Chinese outnumber us, and they will always outnumber us. They spend a little less than we do now on military spending, but that may change at any moment, and their economy is already, by some measures, as big as ours. Our only hope for a sustainable edge is innovation, and now innovation is really tricky. So you've been out here in Silicon Valley for some years now. You've heard what I've heard. The CIA has its venture fund. There's DIUX or DUIX, I can't remember. And you get off the record and have a glass of wine over a dinner, and the entrepreneurs say, oh yeah, easy money. They invest in the wrong ways and at high valuations. They're the government. Of course, they're going to be slow. They're going to be behind the curve. So how does the United States, how does the Pentagon, how do we incorporate innovation fast enough before it's stolen?
Peter, you nailed the essence of a challenge here, and you mentioned that we're still configured to fight and win the Cold War as far as our acquisition and requirement system, and we've got a system that's designed to build incrementally better aircraft carriers, submarines, fighters, every decade or two, and that got us through.
It's good at that. It actually succeeds at that, right?
And Peter, think about it. Our military technology, of the last century was developed in government labs, and our best and brightest out of Stanford and MIT, Harvard, they wanted to go work for the NSA and work for, government primes or military primes. But now our best, you mentioned the military relevant technology now is being developed in the commercial sector, and critically that means that developments and advances in these technologies are driven by consumer demand, not by government directive. So it's turned on its head now, and so we've got to find ways to identify, deploy at speed and scale these technologies, and it's not building a better aircraft carrier every decade. It's getting last week's software update, better, faster, quicker. It's looking at new conflict domains of cyber and space. So, but you nailed it, Peter. But there's an upside there. I do think that innovation that we see here in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, that's hard to steal. China's doing very well at stealing it, but for the actual innovation spirit, I think that's one of the strengths and comparative advantage the U.S. is going to maintain for some time.
Okay. So I have a reform to suggest, Joe. I have two reforms to suggest. This was me as the layman thinking, how can I get extra credit in Joe's class? And here's one reform. You reduce the number of jobs the Pentagon does by outsourcing a lot of it. We've already seen this. Palantir rises. Why? Because it's better at crunching data than the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies. Elon Musk, it turns out. Elon Musk is better at putting up satellites. If we get to Mars, it'll be because Elon Musk gets us there or Jeff Bezos gets us there. And we should be thrilled with this. If there are functions that can be performed better in the private sector, even if they bear directly on national security, let's go for it. Let's use that American strength, scale down the Pentagon. We need fewer officers trying to design the next aircraft carrier and more officers identifying problems and then getting on airplanes and spending a month or two at a time out here in Silicon Valley, finding kids who can solve those problems. Pretty brilliant, wouldn't you say, Joe?
Sure.
No, does something like that sound like a workable idea? Or is it already happening? Probably.
I was just saying, let's give a little credit. I think we do recognize this challenge, and there are efforts to find more ways and more pathways for individuals. So there's even talk of direct commissioning, entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs, and giving them a chance to serve. You mentioned DIU, formerly DIUX.
Right.
Mike Brown, the director there, is a visionary, just doing a great job. His previous director is actually a Hoover visiting fellow, Raj Shaw, whom you know. But we're trying. The DIU is a great example. Ash Carter put it into place. Jim Mattis kept it going, and it's flourishing. The services are developing their own innovation hubs. You got AFWorks for the Air Force, SoftWorks for the Special Operations, NavalX for the Navy. So I think there's a real recognition that the military relevant technology it's out in the private sector, and we got to find ways to identify it and deploy it at scale. But how we're going to fight, the military, I think there's recognition. We're going to see some changes. You're seeing some, you call it outsourcing, but I just think there's a recognition that we're going to find these technologies in the private sector. Shame on us if we don't find ways to do it fast and at scale and speed.
Okay. One more reform I'd like to try on you, or at least one new way. I grant, by the way, you were just very polite, even with me in that last question. So a lot of this stuff is already going on, and my bright idea has come up with an idea that other people have had years ago. Okay, thank you, Joe. But here's another idea: punitive expeditions. Gil Barndollar, writing recently in the Wall Street Journal, quote, America cannot afford to garrison Afghanistan or other failed states endlessly. It can afford to inflict short and sharp punishment, punitive expeditions, brief, high-intensity campaigns to punish sponsors of terrorism and deter others are overdue for a return to America's strategic toolkit, close quote. Joe, let's just drop this idea of creating democracies around the world. It really, really doesn't seem to work very well. The next time a Taliban gives comfort to terrorists who attack us, let's do what we did to the Taliban first in those initial weeks, which is to destroy their regime and kill many of those leaders. But then let's come home. That's the idea, that we don't think in terms of missionary operations. We think in terms of quick, unambiguous punishments.
Peter, I think starting in hindsight, that's certainly an approach that more and more people would have realized it was more appropriate. But let me just make a point in where we are in Afghanistan now. Peter, when we pulled out our last service member in the next coming weeks, think about how limited we are to exert that kind of sharp, short, discrete interventions. We are losing our presence there. That means we're going to have to launch from offshore, which is very, very difficult, very, very expensive. We've lost the support of our allies. The allies had twice as many soldiers serving here recently than the United States did. We're losing all of our allied support. We're losing all our ability to collect intelligence, which you really need presence to collect intelligence. We're losing our ability to provide air support, responsive air support. So I agree with you, Peter. I agree with you. We want to maintain that capability to have those sharp, discrete, targeted interventions. But if we have no one on the ground, which we're going to have very soon, we've greatly limited it, and we've greatly increased the cost of having those. Now we have to float an aircraft carrier out somewhere to project power, or launch, and refuel an air from a base, in somewhere else in the Middle East. So I agree. We need to maintain that capability, and we are losing that capacity to do so, or making it much, much more expensive and much more U.S. centric, and not sharing that burden with allies and partners by leaving Afghanistan. So I think I agree with what you said. And I think that all the more reason to point to I think the mistake is going to be to lose that small presence that we have right now in Afghanistan.
Joe, last question. You have sons, you have kids, you teach here at Stanford, you've taught at the United States Military Academy. A senior comes to you and says, Dr. Felter, I've got two choices. The United States military, let's say the Army. Maybe the kid is ambitious, maybe special forces in the Army. Or I've got an offer here from Facebook or Twitter or Google, tech. What do you advise him or her?
Well, thanks, Peter. And I've had the great privilege of mentoring a lot of students here at Stanford that have an interest in the military. You really got to get to know that young man or woman and really get a sense for, is military service, what he or she thinks it's going to be, and is it right for them? My experience, if they got an inkling to do it, I find it. I encourage them to explore options to do it. And there's a range of ways to do that. Some you can go down an extreme route of special forces, or there's other options. But you really have to get. It's an individual decision. Fortunately, we're in a country that has, a volunteer military, so we don't put the people who don't want to be there in the military. But it's really an individual decision. I've had parents of students contacting me distraught that I'm trying to push their children into the military. But I think it's just empowering them to realize, the goals that they have. And
you feel no impulse to say, listen, go to work for Google.
No, and
the armed forces are a mess. It's not like when I went to West Point, it's a mess. Go to work for. You feel no impulse to say that.
I think it's not just military. I think it's public service, and there's lots of ways to pursue public service. Our own George Shultz, 5 cabinet posts. You ask him to introduce himself, he'll say George Shultz Marine. I mean, there's no greater act of public service than laying down your life for your country. So, but there's other ways to serve. And let me get back to your question, Peter, before we have to end. go to Google. I mean, they're changing the world. Stanford students in our tech companies are changing the world. But I would say, hey, go there, but remember the privileges that you have as an American, that the freedoms, the opportunities that you have as an American that helps a company like Google flourish, and it helps you get to a place like Google. And if you're there for a while and you're in a leadership position, maybe consider that when your country needs some kind of technology like we've seen in the past, and think about that hey, maybe it's not so bad to support your country with some technology, or maybe you, like many people we see here in Silicon Valley, Peter, in this area, maybe you get some means and you're in a position to support some causes, so support some causes that you think strengthen America, and I know this is a friendly crowd here, but I know we have some folks that support the Hoover Institution listening, and hey, I'm a little biased, but I think that's a great example, fund some of the thinking that helps us keep a strong country and make sure that those ideas that define this great free society flourish. So the short answer to the question is, hey, it's an individual. Some people are cut out for the military. I encourage them to do it, because you get to be my age. If you didn't join, there's always that, gosh, I shoulda, coulda, woulda, and you don't want to be that person, even if you serve for a few years. Other ways to do public service, get into public, to politics. There's so many ways to serve, but hey, if you don't want to do any of that, go to Google, do well, help, be a patriot in those organizations, and ensure that the technologies, maybe if your country calls on those technologies, do it. Companies like Palantir certainly do it, but can't say the same for some others. And also, if you get to a point where you can support good causes, be a patriot in how you support those causes, and you can make a difference. You can have impact, not necessarily by putting on the uniform. There's so many other ways to do it, and we see it so many times here at Stanford. The impact these students have is just extraordinary. So hope
be a
that's
patriot.
Roundabout.
Be a patriot. Dr. Joseph Felter, formerly of the United States Army, now of the Hoover Institution. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to spend some time with you.
For Uncommon Knowledge, the Hoover Institution, and Fox Nation, I'm Peter Robinson.